think that the details of the individual and the details of the lobotomy, while a lot went into the accuracy, historically around the procedure and the institutions and that kind of stuff, is probably what interests me the least in the film. I mean, I'm literally using it as a springboard to look at a kind of utopian, American utopian blindness, particularly in masculinity. And he's just, we happen to look at his fall and the complexity of his self-denial throughout the picture. But there are the other two fathers too, for lack of a better word.
And it's kind of in the 50s, the portrayal of the 50s is kind of anti-Lynchian in a way. Like, there's no nostalgia here in your portrayal of that. Like, it's a very austere and cold environment, I would say. I wouldn't say, like, it's not an era I would like to be in, but usually this era is romanticized.
Good, yeah, I don't think we should want to be in the past because it's inaccessible to us and we don't live there. So this cinematic idea of romanticizing and creating nostalgia through intoxication is, like, I think a problem. I think it's it's a testament and a part of a culture of validating and pacifying and satisfying audiences' desires and worldviews, and just sort of coddling them as opposed to challenging them, or opposed to having more utility. So it's intentionally sort of neutering access to the nostalgia for that era. I mean, it's trying to, and just as it neuters access to like Goldblum's charisma at times, and a lot of other things. There's, I'm very interested in the formal components of cinema, the temporal components, but we're a content-driven society now, and so we just look straight through everything, and we don't even know what the chairs we're sitting on are made out of. We have no formal consciousness anymore as societies. Anyway, I can go on.
It's a difficult film to get your kind of grasp on what it is saying. Also, the use of photography in the film I thought was very interesting. This. Everything is being photographed. Everything is by the main character. Actually, these acts, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts about the act of photography and recording, and then yourself making images.
Yeah, I think in keeping with what I was saying about content and form, the Dr. Freeman, Dr. Fiennes, the Goldblum character is essentially trying to secure and propagate a narrative at the expense of all of the formal attributes that he can't contend with. He can't contend with the carnage that he leaves behind him because he's hell-bent on this narrative of salvation. And so that's in keeping with a larger interest, and something that I think the film's trying to do and emphasize, is that this sort of narrative, this obsession with narrative over form, is actually problematic to all our critical consciousness as people. I think a large reason why Donald Trump was elected into the United States, besides Russian interference, the amount of people that came out were intoxicated by his narrative. But a child can look at him and see that he's an orange fanatical buffoon. A child could do that because their critical thinking isn't destroyed by this content-driven media society. So.
I'm wondering if you're familiar or influenced by the work of Roy Andersson, the Swedish director.
I am, but not. I've only seen a couple of the films.
So let's open it up to the audience. Do we have any questions?
Hello.
You can hear me. Who's the Walter Freeman of today in your mind?
Oh. Jeez, that's a good question. I mean, there's so many. Every white American male, I guess. Yeah, I don't know. That's a tough question.
We're all equally ignorant.
If you elaborate on that, what do you mean? How does his...
I mean, it's a condition of privilege, obviously, to not have to contend with your shortcomings. So people in privilege. Obviously, Donald Trump doesn't contend with his shortcomings, nor the sort of coven of madness around him. So there's a lot of those folks. They're very much Friedman-esque. Yeah.
So we are in Sweden, so people are very reserved. Yes, over there.
Thank you so much for the amazing movie.
Oh, thank you.
And slowly this movie gets into the body, mind, and spirit. That was super cool. I just want to ask the question. You have portrayed so amazingly that you changed every single scenes. There was a flipping around, that switching around, and there is so much silence in between. And then I understand those silence are the notes of the movie. For me, those silence, I can feel so much expression, so much feeling, so much emotion on those silence. And then the interesting part of the movie is flowing so quickly with the flipping scenes. How did you came this kind of very extraordinary?
Well, we shot a lot on the axis, the 180 sort of. I don't know. I just is out of an interest of not playing many tricks. There's that, and then there's this, just simplifying things down. Plus, the production was stressful, and we had limited time. So, if you have two shots, this and that are as good as any. But you said the body, mind, and spirit. That's interesting because it's something that we talked about was separating it into these three chapters of the three male figures that were utopian variations on those very things. That the beginning was the body, and the middle part of the film was the mind, and then the spirit was at the end, and it was all about male utopian failures in these blind ambitions and all of those modes.
Yeah, beautifully done.
Yes. Yes, I have a question. It's a lot of the movies spent on the mental institutions, the state hospitals, and then the environment. Did you do a lot of research how it worked back then, or compared to nowadays? If it's how?
Yeah, I mean, those institutions in the States, there was this fellow Kirkbride who developed these very progressive, massive Victorian institutions that had a lot of light and very few people. And they, over the next 70 years, they degraded into overcrowded, hellscapes. But most of those, because of the taboos surrounding mental illness in the States, they're architectural treasures, frankly, that it had just degraded and fell apart and been demolished or were inaccessible to filming. So we found one in upstate New York the former Willard Asylum of the Chronic Insane that's now a drug treatment facility. And we got in there and shot in there, and then we shot some high schools from the turn of the century just because of similar scale architecturally. But, yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm curious about how did Nina Long get involved in the project? It has to be an interesting story behind it.
The question was, how did Denis Lavant get involved in the project?
Email.
Did he want to get involved, or?
No, I'm a huge fan of his, so I reached out, and he responded, and we bonded. He doesn't speak very much English, and actually he speaks more English than he lets on, but he's a little shy about his English. He hasn't done many English-speaking films besides Mr. Lonely, Harmony Korine's, and what else? That's about it. A short film by David Lynch's son in Texas that he shot at one point, he said. We just did Skype chats and just laughed at each other because we had a translator, and then something happened to our translator, and we lost that Skype box. And it was just me and him making faces at each other for 40 minutes. So that was nice. There was direction about the character that was like this sort of disgruntled, immigrant surrealist, and we sort of used Antonin Artaud as like a touchstone for him. Yeah.
Can you tell a bit more about this long monologue in French and English, and what does it bring to the? What did you mean with this one?
Yeah, I mean, it was very important to me that at that point that we sort of, along with in keeping with the characters and their altered mental states, that we struggle a bit with the material. I mean, the monologue was actually much longer to begin with, and it's not nonsense at all. It all has a lot of justification in the mythology of the New Age movement in the West and the backstory of the character. Essentially, there's this mountain in Northern California called Mount Shasta that was a burgeoning center of the New Age movement in America. That was sort of designated that by Madame Blavatsky, who was a theosophist, 19th century spiritualist. And it was interesting to see sort of the birth of a modern type of more secularized spirituality at that point in the film. So a lot of the references he makes are to some of the mythology around this mountain, which are that there's these luminous hermaphrodites live inside the mountain that were slaves of the Atlanteans, which is an actual mythology around this place. Whether or not the audience can unpack and decode that is not really my interest. It's more in the state of his wrestling with his own belief and veracity, and sort of I see him that character as a kind of a harbinger of a failure and collapse of male supremacy in America, and maleness as a sure kind of concrete thing. I think that masculinity. A lot of my films deal with the problems of masculinity, but I also think that it's something, a kind of stoicism in the absence of gender balance is something that men suffer from as much as women. So.
You had a similarly funny story about Ulla Kier.
Yeah. Email. Very similar.
Those guys.
No, Guy Madden, actually, the Canadian filmmaker who's a friend of mine, put us in touch. Udo is great. He's very sweet and rambunctious.
How do you know Guy Madden?
We just were we're fans of each other's movies. Yeah.
Any more questions? Yes, please.
The last point about Mount Shasta and the New Age movement, I'm kind of interested in like this I have to formulate this somehow, sorry. So the burgeoning New Age movement, or like self-help in California and things like S and stuff, like the development of that, this, you know, which stems from sort of marketing ideology and PR, and the way that the image plays into that is, could the camera, or the recording of the camera be connected to that somehow, like the narrative of the camera and the drive of the camera is projecting an image of a utopia in the world, be connected to these.
Oh, I think so. I mean, you're talking, we were mentioning that sort of the obsession with documenting the narrative of these pseudo successes of the lobotomist portion of the film, is sort of can be overlaid on the performative component of the proclamations and the preaching of any sort of spiritual, mode, religion, New Age, or otherwise. So, yeah, I do. I mean, me and Denny talked a lot about making that very performative, almost even falsely so. Like almost an artificial sort of performance, but he's too good to do that entirely.
One more question.
So I understand that the focus was really on the doctor, but how necessary was the role of the boy to, how do you, can you tell us a bit more about the...
Yeah, I have this sort of, I always struggle with protagonists in movies because we use them as avatars. They're sort of this thing that vicariously we see the world through, and we have access to everything. It's this sort of, Oniric wonderland, and usually they're sympathetic to us, and so that we can find access to them, and that really disturbs me, because if in dark rooms, where we make ourselves vulnerable, like when we're sleeping and we see all of these images, I really think it feeds us with certain behaviors, and then we walk out onto the street and we're searching for sympathetic individuals to have access to the world, so which I think just creates a kind of bigotry. But I like the idea of a protagonist that you can't really have access to, that is much like a stranger on the street, and then you don't know what they're thinking or feeling. And I'm just curious about what that does to us as an audience, I know it makes us wrestle, but I think that and our attention goes elsewhere, and we start looking at, we're aware of ourselves in the theater maybe, or we're aware of the frame, or we're aware of the other characters, and it activates us. It makes us a more active audience. So me and Ty, who's actually, we just tamped him down because he's such he was in Mud and Tree of Life and so many movies that he has such fragility and such access to emotion, that we just sort of wanted to just make him a blank slate so that the audience didn't really have any access to him. So.
Okay, thank you everybody for coming, and have a wonderful Saturday night.
Thanks for sticking around.